Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you're new here. I'm Miss Mini Life, and today I'm going to be building a Howl's Moving Castle BookNook. This is my first BookNook, and somehow I completely missed the entire BookNook craze. I've been making miniatures this whole time, so I don't know how I missed that, but this is the very first one I've ever done. I'm gonna link all of the supplies that I used down in the description box. Also, I will link to the pattern that I made. This pattern is nothing too crazy, but I have a pattern for the actual box itself and for the little houses. I made a couple of guides for that. As always, you can get those if you're a member of my Patreon. They're downloadable and you can print them out and do whatever you want with them. And the first thing that we need for this build is a sketch. So I'm gonna sketch out the scene that I want to make a build of. This is one of my favorite scenes from the movie. Come on. So before I even start putting anything together, I usually come up with some kind of a sketch. It doesn't have to be super detailed. Sometimes it's just to get me in the mood to make the thing. But this also gives me a chance to figure out how I want to make what I'm making, what parts I'm going to include. And if I have any reference images that I'm working with, it gives me a chance to study those. Even if the scene is coming directly out of my head, I'll look up reference images of what a house looks like or how tall a tree is, and that'll help me to make sure that everything is in proportion and also that things look more realistic. My next step was to create the skeletons or armatures. I'm making them out of wire that I just had on hand, but usually I use wire from the hardware store and cover it in liquid green stuff, which I'll talk about green stuff a little later in the video. I'm moving on to making the heads for the models, and wasn't really sure how to even go about making their heads because I'm basing it off an anime image, and a lot of the features on the face are just simple lines. The nose might be just a triangle and the mouth may be a straight line at times, so it's difficult to translate over to a three-dimensional object, but I did the best that I could. I still think that the heads are a little bit too big for the bodies in the end, but I feel like I just kind of made them cute. I put those heads to the side for a bit because I'm going to be working on their bodies now, and I'm starting with Sophie. I tried to have some kind of order while working on this where I would be able to hold on to the model and not squish the parts that I had already sculpted. So I'm starting at the top and sort of working my way down her body. I'm working on her shirt first, and then after I get that the way I want it, I'm going to bake it. I'm just bulking out her legs for the time being. I don't think I'll do too much detail because ultimately they're going to be hidden under her skirt. I've rolled out a piece of clay for Sophie's skirt, and I'm using a piece of tinfoil to keep the shape of it while it's in the oven, because sometimes when the clay gets hot, it tends to warp its shape. One of the last things to sculpt is her hair. I really wanted to just say, you know what, the back of her head is none of my concern, and it won't be any of yours because you won't see it in the BookNook. But I went ahead and sculpted it anyway, and then I used some isopropyl alcohol to smooth it down and make it look a little better. Alcohol is great for smoothing out clay, getting rid of any fingerprints or any imperfections that you don't want to be there because it melts the top layer of the clay, and then you can smooth it out with your carving tools or your paintbrush. I really tried my best to get the little details right and stick to what it looks like in the movie. And I was feeling extremely optimistic after finishing Sophie that I was going to be able to do that. But then it was time to move on to Howl. Howl's clothes gave me a lot of trouble. They're so billowy, and I didn't know how to get into like the tiny spaces where two pieces of fabric met, like under his arm where his sleeve was going to meet the side of his body. But I kind of just brute forced my way through sculpting him and just kept tweaking it until it looked how I wanted it to look. I went in the same order with him that I did with Sophie, although I tried to neaten up his pants a little more because I knew in the end they were going to show, whereas Sophie's were going to be hidden by her skirt. So I smoothed everything down as I went along just in case there was a part I was forgetting was going to be visible. Howl's hair is simultaneously super spiky, but also super soft looking. It was crazy, but I think after a lot of trial and error, I ended up with something I was happy with. I aimed more for the shape of his hair than the actual individual strands. I did the first build of his jacket out of clay, and I really like how it looked. I was super proud of it actually. but then I noticed a crack in it. So I went in with some thinned down polymer clay and tried to patch it up, which worked, except then the whole thing just broke off. So in the end, I decided I was going to try using some green stuff to make the jacket instead. Green stuff is a 2-part sculpting putty for people who aren't familiar with it. You mix it together and it dries over time. It usually takes about 24 hours for it to cure. It's a lot stronger than polymer clay, and it also doesn't have to go in an oven to cure, so it's great for things like plastic that would melt in the oven. I'm using the airbrush that was featured in my video a few months ago that Vivor sent me. I really love this thing. It has grown on me so much. And here I'm using it to apply some primer all over the pieces. This is going to be a good base for the paint, so everything goes on more smoothly and sticks to the pieces and doesn't get chipped off or anything like that later on. I'm now using acrylic paints to paint the figures. I'll link to these with all of the other supplies, but these are model color paints, and I also really like these. I had been using acrylic paints from the craft store that were the little ones that come in tubes. They're like $1.50. They're not very expensive, but I found like these have so much better results. The pigment is insane in comparison to those, and it's easier to apply because it's a lot smoother and thinner, which I could not do without at this point. I feel like not having the colors translate to what I wanted them to be when I put them down being one color and then like changing over time drives me insane. So I highly recommend getting some paints that are specifically for models because it's going to be such a big difference. I'm using the images on the back of my DVD case for references and to try and match up the colors. All of the colors are mixed on the side on my wet palette that I made, and they're not just this color directly out of the bottle, but they're pretty easy to mix up, and I just test them out on a paper next to the model and then go ahead and paint the figure. Also, can I just take 1 second to brag about how happy I was to get Sophie's shocked expression down, especially since most of the time while I was trying to do this, my hands were shaking all over the place and I struggled later on. You'll see I didn't have as much success with Howl.
Not so hard, is it?
I'm finishing up by painting Sophie's shoes and underneath her dress, and then I'm keeping it super simple and moving on because I think it looks pretty good right now. And to be fair, painting Howl was another story. I repainted his face like 10 times, honestly. I felt like I kept putting his eyes, his eyes way too high. I kept putting different parts of his face in the wrong place or using the wrong color, and it took me a while to figure him out. In the end, I really just tried to get his expression more than making it look exactly like it looked in the movie. And it was not easy to capture his completely unbothered expression that he has the whole time. I love this scene so much. Sophie is literally freaking out because he's flying her over the buildings and like taking her to another part of town to escape those people who are after them. And he's just like, no big deal. It's fine. The whole time she's freaking out. Painting Howl's face even got so bad that I had to bust out this move, which if you're an artist, you know, sometimes you gotta just get these shaky hands grounded. I had to put him against my knee to be able to try and paint his face correctly. This is what I ended up with, and I'm so thankful to God that I was able to even get this much. But painting the rest of him from then on out was pretty smooth sailing though. I painted his hair and I tried to put a few highlights in there and make sure that this golden blonde hair was different from his skin tone because they kind of wanted to merge together a little bit on me. I had the most fun painting Howl's jacket. This is my favorite part of his clothing, and it's this really nice mix of bright pink and like grayish blue colors that are all over the back. And one thing about Howl is that he takes a lot of pride in his appearance. Actually, he takes it a little bit too far and has a couple of tantrums when his appearance gets messed up. So I wanted to make sure that I really got this jacket looking the way it should. I'm using a synthetic brush to paint all of these details, and it wasn't a super small brush. I think this was like a size 7 or 6 brush that I bought in a packet of like 8 for a few bucks. So not very expensive. And it was perfect for adding all of the details and trim to his jacket. Once the figures were done, it was time to move on to building the actual BookNook. And I made these patterns in Photoshop. Again, they'll be available if you're a member of Patreon. You can just download them. But they were pretty simple to make. I basically just made a box minus the front of the box. So I have 3 sides here and a top and a bottom. I'm going to be cutting them out of some cardboard that's called chipboard. And then I started painting the sides. I painted it with some of the acrylic paint that I mentioned earlier. That's not for models. It's normal craft paint that you can get at any craft store. It comes in small little tubes. And I'm trying to give it a watercolor effect because that's how most of the images in the movie look. And I'm trying to keep these clouds in the background really nice and fluffy like they were in the movie. But I'm also going to just mark in where I want the city to be. That's what all the brown smudges at the bottom of the screen are. And I will cover those up later with buildings. So it's going to be not that important to paint them. And now that I mentioned those buildings, it's time to move on to making them. When I made the pattern for the boxes in the computer, I also went ahead and made a couple of guides for the houses. This is just going to help me to make them the right size for the scene. And they're very basic. They're just a couple of rectangles and triangles. So you can do this yourself either by hand or on the computer pretty easily. And I'm just going to cut those out of some chipboard or cardstock. I use a mix of all of them. And I'm saving some of the scraps because I think I can use them for some of the decorations on the front. Now I'm cutting out some windows out of the buildings and I'm going to back these with some black paper so that they have a little bit of depth to them. I didn't really worry too much about precision with this. These are all going to be in the background. For some of the buildings, I'm going to be leaving them sort of blank, just maybe one color. And then on a few of them, I'm giving them these cute little European architectural designs that are on the buildings in the movie. I think this is what gives the city a lot of its charm. I thought about folding this building up and having it be one of the buildings in the front of the BookNook, but I actually think this is the perfect background. It's just detailed enough, but also kind of messy. So I'm placing this one in the back of the BookNook and I'm gonna leave it flat and just add a couple of details to the roof, but I'm raising it up a little bit so that I can build all of the buildings with a slope coming forward and create a little forced perspective. That's gonna help sell the effect that these buildings are going back farther than they actually are in this tiny box. And I'm just gluing everything in place with some white glue and trying to build out the city one building at a time. Now is also when I need to add on the sides of the buildings, and I'm coloring in the bottom of the BookNook, even though you're not going to be able to see it because all of the buildings will be blocking it. But just in case any little parts peek through, I tried to vary the color and detail of each building, but the main thing that was important to me was that they were sloping down towards the front of the BookNook. After I glued in a few buildings, I started putting in the roofs. This is just cardstock paper that I'm trimming as I glue it down to the tops of the buildings. And I'm gonna be painting this later on, but right now I'm trying to make sure there's no gaps. Most of the buildings that I made all look pretty much the same other than the design on the front. But one building that I wanted to make sure I had was a round turret-like building that I saw in my reference image of Howl and Sophie. It's a building that Howl touches down on for like a quick second as they're hopping through the air. And I thought about making it out of clay, but then I ended up making it out of paper, and the roof was a little bit tricky, but I cut these mostly triangular shaped pieces with a little bit of curved on the side and then glued those together. It had 6 sides to the building, but when I tried to glue the 6 triangles together, I could only make 5 of them fit. Every once in a while, I run into that kind of problem while I'm crafting, and I actually like math and I like geometry and figuring these things out usually, but this time it was just not that important, so I went with 5 sides for the roof. As I'm painting all of the other roofs, I'm just using a very impressionistic approach to this and dotting on different colors of brown and lighter tan to give the effect that there are shingles, because it's too small for me to put individual shingles all over this thing, and it would kind of be a waste of time. I'm gluing on the side of the BookNook now, and I need to make sure that there are no gaps where the light's going to show through in the back of the BookNook, so I'm going to put something really heavy on top of it. Now I finally have to put Howl and Sophie together. I'm using green stuff because I know it'll be strong enough once it cures so that they'll be like a single piece. Also, Howl's hand broke off. He's been having a hard time this build. I think it's something to do with my oven that I'm using. Now I'm gonna cut out the front of the box. I probably could have cut this out when I cut out all of the other box pieces, but Here we are doing it at the very end. And this is really important because this is where all of the light for the BookNook is going to come from. I'm not putting any LEDs into this one, so I wanted the opening to be as big as possible. After all of the glue has dried, it's time to go in and paint this with some white acrylic paint. And I also need to put Howl and Sophie in. I'm just going to use some green stuff for that and attach them to one of the buildings in the very front, the one that we made specifically for them to be stepping on. And then go over that with some more acrylic paint to blend everything in. I put a little tissue in there to hold it in place while it cured. Now I'm just gonna go in and do some finishing touches, touch up the roofs, and add in some more white to these clouds to make them a little bit more fluffy. Now I'm doing the dry brushing that I mentioned earlier to age the outside of the box, and it's basically complete. And that means it's time for patron shoutouts. Big thank you to Ines E, Bold Fashioned, KNZ, Grouchy Old Man, Fatal Gift, Pat M, Suki T, Lizzie B, Ryan R, Cheryl R, Julia ST, Fred C, Isaac W, Naomi M, Lori R, Gabriel K, and Awkward Burb. And shout out to the other viewers like you who are out there helping to support the channel through Patreon or likes and thumbs up and subscribes. I really appreciate you guys. I'll see you really soon in the next video. Bye.